Hello friends! Welcome to another episode of Crafting with Cocktails Tutorials! Today we're going to show you how to sew on buttons. A couple of different varieties of buttons that you can sew on. Basic 4-hole button. I have a 2-hole button. I have a smaller 4-hole and a even smaller 2-hole because I'm going to show you how to put on a button with a shank.
Shank.
Shank. You don't know what a shank is yet. Believe it or not, a shank is not something that you shiv your, fellow inmates with.
Thank you very much.
I also have this button, which is kind of it has a built-in shank, so to speak. I tend to take off more thread than I should when I'm hand stitching because I'm a champion. Now a little trick that I do, which isn't really a trick at all, is I double up my thread when I put it through the needle. Once you have your doubled up thread, sometimes you can even triple it up or quadruple it up. I learned that in the trenches of Nam. Specifically,
you need
Nom. I learned it in the kitchen. We're going to start with just the basic big ass button. Usually a big ass button like this is either going to be sewn on a coat or it's going to be completely decorative and you're going to sew it haphazardly onto an ugly holiday sweater. So let's start with that. If it's just going to be decorative, you don't have to plaster that shit on there. You can just do a simple stitch on there to make sure it stays on, not specifically holding any weight to it. So I like to start by tying a knot in your thread, then putting the thread through your fabric and just kind of knotting it off right there. Then you stick the thread through the hole of the button. I like to have the plus sign look on the front of my buttons because I think it is about twice as adorable. But you can also have the equal sign. I usually go through each side twice. Once you go through each hole twice, I put the needle through the fabric but not through the button again. And then you can just tie it off, just loop it around and give it a nice little tie off there. Boom! Look! That actually works! Wow, how delectably functional. What an adorable looking button! How did you do it, Grant? Watch the tutorial again. Next I'm going to show you how to put a button on with a shank. Yup. Shank.
Do you know that a shank is actually a cut of meat as well?
Yes, actually. I did know that. I don't know what cut of meat that would be.
A sheep shank is also a knot, how one ties a rope. Sheep shank.
Heavens. Shanks are so multifunctional. Just like you did with the first one, you stitch that button on initially. But since we're going to put a shank on this one, you need an extra tool of sorts. I like to use a nail, actually. And you just put that nail in between the fabric and the button so that it raises the button up a little bit. And we'll get to why in just a moment. But this nail looks sufficiently janky. Alright, so you stick that nail in there and stitch that around that nail so that it raises up just a skosh. You usually want to use more thread when you are stitching it on, like just stitch it a whole lot. And also you can add a little button to the back to reinforce it a little bit so it won't tear a hole in the fabric. It will instead put all of that stress on the itty bitty button on the back, thus saving your garment from yourself. Just like we did before, you can take the nail out at this point, stitch through, and don't pull tight because you want that space to remain between the button and the fabric. Wrap the thread around the thread that you just stitched through. There you have it. That's how you sew a shank into a button with a reinforcing button on the back. We do that because this is going to be buttoned through something, presumably a thick coat. So you need that extra space in there for that extra piece of fabric that you're buttoning it through. Now, it might not always be best practice to make a knot in the thread before you stitch into it, but I always like to do that just because it makes me feel like it's more reinforced overall. And it's really about how you feel about the entire project. This kind of button is the one that already has a shank on it. On a lot of vintage clothing, they'll use these just decoratively. This is also what we call a covered button. Again, just start by stitching into that fabric. You can also stitch in, loop through the button, and then tie it off and pull it tight. Next, how we make a political button. Wow, you have 3/4 magical buttons already sewn on. What is there left to do? Well, if you have a shirt button, then you could do the same kind of hybrid between these two buttons. So you're going to take a button, do the little stitch into it to start. We'll do an equal sign version this time. Alright, now just do, you didn't put a nail in there, but you're going to make a small shank by doing it once, twice, 3 times a lady, and stitch through, tie it off. There we go, and that's how I'd suggest doing a shirt button. Maybe next time I'll do a buttonhole. Buttons! Crafting with cocktails! Tutorials.